We're talking about a fascinating new documentary from CBS Reports exploring the American bison's return from the brink of extinction. 100 years ago, the iconic bison were overhunted and nearly wiped out as a result.
In 2009, scientists in Mexico did something that looked like a total failure. They trucked 23 American bison into the middle of a barren, lifeless desert. There was no grass, no streams, and no human help. Locals thought it was a joke. But a decade later, when cameras flew over that same patch of land, what they found was so shocking it changed ecology books.
Bison are now roaming on tribal lands in eastern Washington after nearly 2 centuries. Cody Proctor with our Environment Northwest team shows us how the reintroduction is not only improving the ecosystem, but also deep cultural connection.
The desert was gone, replaced by something unimaginable. The crazy part is, it wasn't just the land that returned. Something else, long thought vanished, came back too. The end of an era. Long before a single highway, city, or barbed wire fence cut across the face of North America, a different kind of power ruled the continent. It wasn't a king or a government. It was an animal, the American bison. This was a rolling, thundering force of nature. Estimates, and these are just guesses, put their numbers at over 60 million. That's a number so big it's hard to even picture. Imagine standing on a small hill on the Great Plains. You wouldn't just see a herd, you would see a dark, shaggy ocean of animals stretching to every horizon. Explorers from that time wrote in their journals that a single herd could be 25 miles wide and 50 miles long. It could take 3 full days for the entire herd to pass a single point. The ground would shake not for minutes, but for days on end, a constant low rumble you felt in your chest. This wasn't just a group of animals, it was a moving landscape, a force that shaped the land itself. Their hooves, all 240 million of them, constantly stirred and tilled the soil, planting seeds as they walked. Their grazing patterns, always moving, shaped the growth of the prairie grasses, encouraging deep roots and preventing any single plant from taking over. Their migrations, which stretched from the cold forests of Canada all the way down to the warm grasslands of northern Mexico, were the lifeblood of the plains. They were, in every sense, the heart of the continent. For countless centuries, indigenous communities lived in a deep, powerful balance with these herds. The bison was everything. It was food, providing thousands of pounds of meat. It was shelter, with thick hides becoming teepees that could withstand the fiercest prairie winds. Its bones were carved into tools, its sinew became bowstrings, and even its stomach was used as a water-carrying vessel. Every single part of the animal had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. This relationship wasn't one of simple hunting, it was one of deep respect and reciprocity. Indigenous cultures understood a fundamental truth. Their survival was completely tied to the bison's survival. The animal was sacred. But here's the deal. That all changed. When European settlers began their push west in the 18th and 19th centuries, the bison's world was shattered. The mindset was different. The land wasn't something to live with. It was something to be tamed and conquered. At first, the hunting was for subsistence, but then the railroads came. The crazy part is how fast it all fell apart. The railroads sliced the continent in two, and with them came a new kind of hunter. They weren't hunting for survival, they were hunting for profit, and sometimes just for sport. It became a grim pastime for passengers to shoot bison from the windows of a moving train, leaving the massive bodies to rot on the prairie. This soon turned into an industry. What most people don't realize is this was a full-scale industrial operation. By the 1870s, bison hides became a massive commodity. Factories in the East needed tough leather belts to drive the new machines of the Industrial Revolution. A bison hide was perfect. Gangs of hide hunters spread across the plains. A good hunter could take down over 100 bison in a single day. They would take the hide and maybe the tongue, which was considered a delicacy in restaurants back east. The rest? Thousands of pounds of meat per animal were left to scavengers. It was a systematic removal. The plains became a boneyard. Entire fields, miles and miles wide, were white with sun-bleached bison skulls. Later, a new industry popped up: bone pickers. These were people who went out and collected the millions of bones, loaded them onto trains, and shipped them east to be ground into fertilizer and carbon for processing sugar. But there was something darker happening too. The United States military saw the mass culling as a strategic tool. They knew that if the bison disappeared, the indigenous nations of the plains would lose their main source of food, their shelter, their entire way of life. It was a deliberate strategy to force them onto reservations. High-ranking officers openly supported it. The result was an ecological and human catastrophe. The speed was terrifying. From tens of millions at the start of the 1800s, the population fell to just a few million by 1870. The real freefall happened next. By 1889, just 19 years later, there were fewer than 550 wild bison left in the entire United States. They survived only in tiny hidden pockets, like the remote Pelican Valley of what would become Yellowstone National Park. And in Mexico, the story was even more final. The bison were hunted entirely out of the country. Gone. By the end of the 19th century, the species had completely vanished from Mexican soil, a land where it had thrived for millennia. The loss was more than just the animal. It was the keystone species being pulled from the arch, and without it, the entire structure of the grasslands began to unravel, the forgotten prairie. When the last bison vanished from Mexico, the land didn't collapse overnight. It was a slow, creeping change, like a sickness settling in. For centuries, the thunder of the herds had been the landscape's heartbeat. Now there was just silence. At first, people just noticed the emptiness. The horizon, once alive with the movement of dark herds, was now still. No dust clouds stirred in the distance, but over the years, that deep silence began to change the land itself. The absence of the bison rippled through the ecosystem like a slow, unstoppable drought. Here's the deal. Northern Mexico's plains, which were once vast, rolling seas of green grass, began to harden. Without millions of heavy hooves cracking and churning the surface, the soil compacted. Think of it like this. The ground, which was once like a sponge, turned into a brick. This hard crust, known as hardpan, acted like a layer of concrete. When the seasonal rains came, the water couldn't soak in. It had nowhere to go. Instead of seeping deep into the ground to recharge the water table, the rain just hit the hard surface and ran off, taking the precious topsoil with it. This erosion was devastating. Streams that once carried steady, clear flows all year long began to dwindle. They became flashy, meaning they would flood violently for a few hours after a storm and then, just as quickly, dry up to a dusty trickle. The grass, the very foundation of the prairie, couldn't survive. Its roots couldn't push through the compacted earth. The seeds couldn't find purchase. Where a sea of nutritious prairie grass once waved, new, tougher plants crept in. These were the only things that could survive. Thorny bushes, spiny mesquite, and creosote. These desert plants could handle the hard soil and lack of water. The landscape transformed from a soft green grassland into a brittle, prickly desert of thorns. This change had a domino effect. The land, once alive with the sounds of insects and birds, fell eerily quiet. The only sound was the hiss of the dry wind blowing through dry, thorny branches. Local farmers and ranchers felt it too. They replaced the vanished bison with cattle. But here's the catch. Cows and bison are totally different. Bison are restless. They graze and move, walking miles every day. This prevents any one area from being overgrazed. Cattle, on the other hand, tend to linger. They stay in one place, often near a water source, and strip it bare. They eat the grass all the way down to the dirt. What they left behind wasn't a healthy, grazed pasture. It was just bare, trampled earth. When the winds came, this exposed topsoil, which had taken thousands of years to build, just blew away as dust. The infamous Dust Bowl of the 1930s was a direct consequence of this same process. Removing the native bison and grasses and replacing them with farming and cattle. This ecological collapse cascaded through every living thing. The prairie dogs, once called engineers of the plains, faded away. Their populations, which had been in the billions, crashed. The hardened soil was impossible to burrow into, and without the bison grazing the grass short, the tall, dense brush made it easy for predators to sneak up on them. What most people don't realize is that without prairie dogs, the land lost its master tillers. No more burrows aerating the soil, no more tunnels mixing nutrients, and no more abandoned burrows acting as traps for precious rainwater. And of course, the animals that depended on the prairie dogs vanished too. The black-footed ferret, whose diet is over 90% prairie dogs, was pushed to the very edge of vanishing from Earth. The burrowing owl, which uses prairie dog tunnels to nest, had nowhere to raise its young. The silence just got deeper. Hundreds of species that were once interlocked like tiny gears in a perfect machine were now broken and scattered. The insects that thrived in the nutrient-rich droppings of bison were gone. The pollinators that loved the prairie wildflowers were sparse. A once vibrant system full of life and sound had crashed into a broken, silent loop. It was a desert of thorns. For the local communities, this was a daily hardship. The compacted soil meant less usable grazing land for their livestock. Wells dried up faster because the land just couldn't hold water anymore. The land was, for all intents and purposes, dying. Elders in these communities would tell their grandchildren stories of their own grandparents who remembered endless bison herds. They talked about rivers that flowed all year and grass so tall it could hide a horse. By the mid-20th century, these stories sounded like myths, like pure fiction. The land in front of them was just brittle, prickly, and empty. But it was in this very place, this desert of thorns and silence, that a crazy idea was born. If the disappearance of one single animal caused this entire collapse, could the return of that same animal spark a renewal? It sounded impossible. The land looked too far gone. It looked too dead to heal. A group of scientists, however, thought otherwise. They believed nature doesn't forget, it just waits. The stage was set for one of the most daring ecological gambles of the 21st century. The return to a dead land. By the late 2000s, much of northern Mexico's grasslands in the state of Chihuahua looked more like a postcard from Mars. The soil was cracked and hard. The rivers were ghosts. The wildlife was gone. For decades, experts had tried to fix the problem with human tools. They planted special grasses. They dug irrigation channels. They even tried spraying seeds from airplanes, but nothing worked. None of it lasted. The land seemed permanently broken. But a small, dedicated group of conservationists and scientists had a different idea. It was a radical idea. They believed the healing wouldn't come from human machines. It would come from the return of the very animals that had built that ecosystem in the first place, the American bison. So here's the deal. After years of complicated planning, international agreements, and heated debates, the project was approved. In 2009, a transport truck rumbled down a dusty road in the Maderas del Carmen Reserve, part of the Chihuahuan Desert. Inside were 23 American bison. Just 23 animals. They weren't just any bison either. They were genetically pure bison, descendants of the herds that had survived in the mountains, sourced from Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. They were a living link to the continent's past. To outsiders, the entire plan looked absurd. It was madness. Why would you release 2,000-pound animals, creatures famous for loving lush grass, into a barren desert with barely enough food or water for a goat? Critics were loud. They mocked the project as a doomed publicity stunt. Local ranchers were deeply worried. They feared the bison would break through their fences, compete with their cattle for the tiny amount of available grass, or spread diseases. Even some government officials were skeptical, worried that precious conservation money was being wasted on animals that had been gone from the country for more than 100 years. But the scientists had a very specific and very bold vision. And this is the crazy part. They chose not to interfere. Once those 23 bison were released, that was it. There would be no supplemental feeding stations, no special water troughs, no protective enclosures to hide them from predators or the elements. The herd would have to roam completely freely, just as their ancestors had. The logic was as simple as it was brutal. If the bison couldn't survive on their own, the ecosystem was truly too far gone. But if they could survive, if they could find food and water in that wasteland, they might just trigger the natural processes that no human plan had ever managed to replicate. The release itself was a moment thick with tension and hope. The heavy transport trucks backed into position. The gate swung open with a loud metallic groan. The animals hesitated for a moment, sniffing the strange dry air of a land their kind had not touched in 5 generations. Then, one by one, the 23 pioneers stepped out. Their massive shoulders swayed as their shaggy coats brushed against the thorny shrubs. Dust rose beneath their hooves as they began to move, not in a panic, but with a slow, steady, ancestral confidence. They clustered together, surveyed the empty landscape, and started walking. For the first time in more than a century, wild bison were once again on Mexican soil. For the first few weeks, observers watched with their hearts in their throats. The animals wandered through the desert, scrounging for what little forage they could find. Many feared they would starve, but then something amazing happened. The bison began to adapt. Their ancient instincts, dormant for generations, kicked in. They used their massive heads and hooves to dig into the hard ground, uncovering hidden roots and finding pockets of moisture. They didn't just eat the dry, dead grass. They selectively grazed on the tough shrubs, weeding out the invasive plants in a way that gave native grasses a chance to regrow. And most importantly, they didn't stay put. They kept moving, walking miles every single day, spreading their impact across the land. And the land began to respond. The soil, locked up and compact for decades, started to loosen under the constant pressure of their heavy hooves. When the first rains came after their arrival, a small miracle happened. Instead of just running off the hardpan, the water collected in their footprints, it soaked in. Within a few months, tiny green shoots of native grasses began to appear in places that had been bare dirt for years. Locals who had written off the project as a failure started to notice the change. Small birds, unseen for ages, returned to perch on the new blades of grass. The sight of the first reddish-brown calves being born into the herd, healthy and strong, brought a wave of hope. In less than a year, the 23 pioneers were not just surviving. They were flourishing. Against all odds, the desert was coming back to life. But how? How could a handful of animals succeed where years of human effort had failed? The secret wasn't magic. It was biology. Architects of the prairie. The revival of northern Mexico's barren plains wasn't a mystery. It was a masterclass in biology, happening in plain sight. What shocked observers the most was how fast the land responded. The explanation was hidden in the bison's simplest, most basic daily behaviors. Every movement, every mouthful of food, every footprint, and even every time they rolled in the dust was actively reshaping the environment. The bison weren't just living in the desert, they were acting as ecosystem engineers, using nothing but their own bodies to restore a dead landscape. It all starts with the hooves. What most people don't realize is that a bison's hoof is different from a cow's. It's sharper and their weight is distributed differently. Unlike cattle, which, as we said, linger and strip one spot bare, bison are restless wanderers. They walk miles every single day. As they move, their heavy, sharp hooves press into the ground like thousands of tiny, natural plows. On Chihuahua's hardened, cement-like soil, this was revolutionary. Decades without bison had left that crust that blocked all the rain, but with every single step, the herd was cracking that crust open. Thousands, then millions of tiny fissures and footprints appeared in the hardpan. These little cracks and divots became entry points for the two things the soil desperately needed: air and water. Scientists who came to study the project later measured exactly how much more rainfall soaked into the ground in bison-trodden areas compared to untouched patches right next to them. The difference was dramatic. The bison's footprints were acting like millions of tiny basins, catching the rain and holding it, giving it time to soak deep into the earth. Where cattle left barren, compacted dirt, the bison were creating the perfect conditions for seeds to sprout. Then there's the waste. Bison waste is anything but waste. It's a powerhouse of nutrients. It is packed with the exact things plants crave: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. A single bison herd scatters tons of this high-powered, all-natural fertilizer across the plains every year, and they do it for free, without any chemicals. Soil samples taken before the bison's arrival and then again just a few years after showed that nitrogen levels in the soil rose by nearly 40% in the areas they grazed. This massive nutrient boost jump-started the growth of native plants, which in turn fed insects, which fed rodents, which fed birds and foxes. Basically, the bison were carrying the missing ingredients for the prairie's revival inside their own bodies and delivering it exactly where it was needed. But here's the catch: it's not just what they eat, but how they eat. Bison are roughage eaters. They love the tough, fibrous grasses. Their grazing is a form of natural mowing. By eating the tall, dominant grasses, they create space and sunlight for other, more delicate plants to grow, like wildflowers and legumes. This instantly increases the biodiversity of the area. And get this, their shaggy fur is also a tool. As they walk, their coats pick up thousands of seeds from one plant and then drop them miles away in a new spot. They are nature's perfect seed spreaders. Even more amazing, some seeds pass right through the bison's digestive system, get roughed up by the acids, and are then deposited on the ground in their own personal pile of warm, moist fertilizer. This process, endozookery, is the most effective way to plant a prairie. Even their playful habits had a massive impact. Bison love to wallow. They find a dusty spot and roll around on their backs, scratching an itch and covering themselves in dirt to ward off insects. This behavior creates shallow, bowl-like depressions in the earth, some as big as 15 feet wide. At first, these wallows look like patches of destruction, but the opposite is true. These little basins are crucial. They collect rainwater, creating tiny, temporary wetlands, microhabitats. These mini ponds become breeding grounds for frogs and insects and vital drinking spots for birds and small mammals. And because the bison have churned up the soil, the edges of these wallows become perfect seed beds, sprouting a rich ring of different plants. They were turning empty patches of dust into oases of life. The ripple effects spread rapidly. The land, as ecologists described it, was breathing again. But the most unimaginable part wasn't just the return of the grass. As the soil softened and the grasses returned, something even more surprising happened. Creatures that had vanished for decades, animals that were themselves ghosts, began to reappear. Quite literally, following the bison back home. An entire world reborn. When scientists released those first 23 bison in 2009, their biggest hope was just to see some grass. What they didn't and couldn't expect was the incredible chain reaction that followed. A decade later, the proof was undeniable. Where the bison walked, an entire lost world of other animals followed, each one tied to the next, slotting back into place like gears in a machine. The return of the prairie dogs, the black-footed ferrets, and the burrowing owls was the clearest signal that the land wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. The prairie dogs were the first to come back in large numbers. These little animals were once so numerous, their towns or colonies covered thousands of square miles of the plains. But as we saw, when the bison vanished, the prairie dogs crashed. The ground was too hard, the brush too tall.
As soon as the bison returned, so did the exact conditions the prairie dogs needed. The heavy hooves broke up the hardpan, making the soil soft enough to dig again, and the bison's constant grazing kept the grasses short, which is exactly what prairie dogs need to be able to see their predators, like eagles and coyotes, from a distance. Within just a few years, the silence of the desert was broken. The high-pitched, chirping alarm calls of prairie dog sentinels returned, a noise that many locals hadn't heard since they were children. Ecologists were thrilled. Why? Because prairie dogs aren't just another rodent. They are a keystone species all on their own. Their endless network of tunnels, which can go 10 feet deep and 50 feet long, acts as a massive underground irrigation system. The tunnels channel rainwater deep into the earth, stopping erosion and recharging the groundwater. Their digging constantly recycles nutrients, bringing rich soil to the surface, and their colonies, the towns, serve as a foundation for hundreds of other species. One of those species was the black-footed ferret. This is, without exaggeration, North America's rarest mammal. For decades, it was thought to be completely gone from Earth. Then, in 1981, a small isolated population was discovered in Wyoming. From those few animals, a desperate captive breeding program began. The ferret's survival depends almost entirely on one thing: prairie dogs. They make up over 90% of its diet. No prairie dogs means no ferrets. It's that simple. So, as the prairie dog towns in the Madeira's Del Carmen Reserve began to spread and stabilize, wildlife managers seized the opportunity. They began to reintroduce black-footed ferrets into the recovering grasslands. And it worked.
The ferrets, nocturnal and incredibly shy, found a landscape suddenly bursting with food and shelter. A single ferret family can go through more than 200 prairie dogs in a single year, which helps keep the prairie dog population in a healthy balance. The ferrets also use the abandoned burrows as their dens. The system was cycling back to perfect equilibrium. Then came the burrowing owls. These small, long-legged birds are one of the most unique owls in the world. Unlike most of their cousins, who nest in trees, these owls live underground. But here's the catch: they can't dig their own homes. They are completely dependent on finding empty tunnels made by prairie dogs or other burrowing animals. With the prairie dogs gone, the owls had vanished from the barren desert. But now, with the colonies expanding, the owls followed. Visitors and researchers began to see them standing guard at burrow entrances, bobbing up and down, or darting low over the new grasses to hunt for insects. Their return was more than just symbolic. It was proof that the desert wasn't just getting greener, it was becoming structurally whole again, from 10 feet below the ground to the skies above. These three animals, the prairie dog, the ferret, and the owl, didn't just return by chance, they were part of what scientists call a trophic cascade. It's a fancy term for a simple, beautiful idea. One key animal is returned and it sends positive reverberations all the way through the ecosystem. The bison break the ground and fertilize it. The prairie dogs dig into that soft soil and build towns. The ferrets and owls move into those towns, linking predator and prey and habitat into one perfect living cycle. What amazed researchers the most was the speed. In less than a decade, a landscape that had been silent for 100 years was suddenly echoing with animal voices. Farmers reported seeing pronghorn antelope, which had also been scarce, returning to graze alongside the bison. Quail and meadowlarks, birds of the grassland, were nesting in the new grasses. The entire food web was snapping back into place. The bison story proves that even the most broken landscapes can heal. But was this a special case, or could this strategy save dying ecosystems all over the world? Let us know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that change how you see the world.